town of Milton has voted to defy state law and reject new zoning rules mandated by the MBTA Communities Act, which aims to build more multifamily housing in cities and towns near T-stops. Town officials approved the new rules in December, but residents forced a referendum, and the opponents won.
Very disappointed in the vote.
In response, the state is threatening legal action and saying that Milton's putting its state funding at risk. So what is going to happen next, and what does all of this mean for the state's housing crisis? Joining me are GBH News transportation reporter Bob Seay and Boston Globe columnist and Milton resident Shirley Leung. Thank you both for being here. So Shirley, as I just mentioned, you live in Milton. You've been writing about this. Can you start by explaining what specifically was voted down this week? Because it wasn't that Milton said, we're not going to comply with this law, period. What did Milton vote down?
So there was a group of residents who put this on the ballot, and it was a Valentine's Day election, and we all went to the polls to answer one question: yes or no. Would we approve? The town meeting had in December had this plan to create 2,400 more multifamily housing units. Would we approve that zoning plan? And that was voted down. 54% of those who went to the polls voted it down. So a decisive victory for no. And you have to keep in mind, like, this issue was so huge. There were lawn signs, yes and no. It pitted neighbors against neighbors. You almost didn't want to ask your neighbor how they were voting because it was so contentious.
Why did the no side win?
They were very passionate, and many of them live in East Milton. And the way the zoning plan was proposed, most of the multifamily housing would go in their neighborhood. So they were concerned about congestion, maybe the impact on their property values. So those who would be most affected by the new zoning rules voted against it.
Now, I live north of the city, and I very much embody this fact that there's a split between people who live north and south of the city. So Milton's terra incognita to me. What differentiates East Milton from other parts of the city? I've read that it is already more congested. Is that true?
East Milton is the part of town that's closest to the 93 expressway. So if you're coming off the expressway and going into Milton, chances are you're driving through East Milton.
Okay.
So there's a lot of commerce on that side of town. I live on the other side of town, which is closer to the trolley, and we just don't have as much commercial area, and it's much more kind of traditional single-family residential.
I'm glad you brought up the trolley. We will get to that in a little bit, but not just yet. Bob Seay, can you take a step back and remind viewers what it is that this MBTA Communities Act does and doesn't do? What does it require communities, or I was going to say across the state, and it's not quite across the state, but we do have a map that we can bring up. There are a whole bunch of communities in the greater Boston area, in eastern Massachusetts, that have an obligation under this. There you see all the communities that are going to have to participate on one level or another. There are 4 tiers of participation depending on the transit access that you have. But remind people, what does this law do?
Well, it's an extension, really, of what is a feeling that transit-oriented development is the way to go in terms of developing housing, because it puts people around transit access places where they can, more easily get back and forth to where they're going without having to drive. So this law really pertains to all 177 MBTA communities, those that receive service, but it first applies to 12 communities who receive the most service, the so-called rapid transit communities that have T service. So this is where the action's taking place right now. And it requires, tell me if I've got this right, it requires communities to create one district in town where multifamily housing can be built by right. The density of that housing depends on how much access that community has. It's supposed to be near the T, the MBTA broadly speaking, whether it's a bus stop or a commuter rail stop or a subway stop. And in that district, there can't be age restrictions on the multifamily units that are built, and they need to be family friendly. So not just geared towards singles, for example, and couples. Okay. Shirley, in your column after the vote, you urged the town of Milton, your hometown of Milton, to come up with a plan that the town can support. And I want to quote you.
You wrote, "To those neighbors who voted no, please don't think of this as your Boston Tea Party. The state's not our colonial overlord. This is about working together to solve a housing crisis that threatens the state's economic future. It's about kids growing up in Milton being able to stay in their hometown when they have families. If we don't start building more homes, the young and talented will flock to more affordable states." But I found myself wondering, after I read that, I've seen quotes from people in Milton who were very happy with the no vote, who seem to think of this as their Boston Tea Party. So do the opponents in Milton who prevailed this week, do they want a different plan that will bring Milton in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, or do they want no plan at all and massive resistance to this act?
That remains to be seen. I mean, yes, I think some part of the no faction said we want a better plan. I think some people who voted no don't want to comply at all. And now in full disclosure, I voted yes. And I'm urging yes and no sides to come together and come up with a plan, because there are consequences if Milton does not comply with the state law. Whether it's Attorney General Campbell, Andrea Joy Campbell, threatening to sue us, or Maura Healey has said she might cut off state funding.
Has she said she would cut off a lot of state funding, or she's kind of left it up to the imagination, right? Some state funding of some type? We don't really know.
Well, the Healey administration has put out a list of potential grants they could withhold, and so
what's on the list?
A lot of it's like housing grants, but it's unclear. Like, would she go as far as cutting off school lunch program? Would she go as far as cutting off roads? We don't know at this point. So that's why I urged my fellow residents to get together, work with the planning board, come up with a plan as soon as possible.
It's probably worth mentioning really quickly that this was a law passed by or under the administration of former Governor Charlie Baker. This is not a Maura Healey initiative. She's supportive of it. She's enforcing it, but she did not create it or spearhead it. Bob, we saw, as Shirley was making the point she just made, a picture of the somewhat unique transit entity in Milton that makes it one of the first communities that has to comply with this law. And for some of our viewers, they will have been looking at that orange train and saying, what is that? What is the mass transit entity that puts Milton at the top of the list here when it comes to compliance?
Well, it is the Mattapan trolley, which dates from the 1940s. Those cars are classics. They've been restored. And a lot of people in Milton might say, well, gee, that's not really rapid transit. But in fact, the MBTA considers it part of the Orange Line, and it is part of the rapid transit system, whether Milton residents agree or not. So that's what has elevated Milton to the eligibility or the requirement that it has to create this zoning.
Shirley, I see you wanting to hop in.
I was going to say, the cars are orange, but it actually feeds into the red line. It's a little confusing for riders, but that's another reason why being classified a rapid transit community versus maybe a commuter rail or adjacent, you had lower density requirements, that energized the no side.
And there was an effort made to get that classification, right? The lower classification with less building required.
Yes, and the state rejected that push.
I have been on the Mattapan trolley, I think, one time, taking it out to an interview, and I felt like I traveled back in time to 1950.
That is right.
It was really a very different
experience. It's a single trolley. People are like, is it like the Green Line, Shirley? I was like, no, it's not like the Green Line. It is literally it's like that Boston trolley that runs around town on wheels. It's just a single car.
And did you say, I want to be very clear about this, is the Mattapan trolley, as it comes through Milton, it is on the other side of town from where this new building district was proposed,
yes,
right?
Yes. So there's several districts where you can build more multifamily housing. And I think that's another thing that energized the no. Why are we are one of the parts of town that's furthest from the trolley.
Well, I could see that.
Why do we get hit with the biggest amount of housing?
That seems like a good question. Bob, you get the last word here very briefly. Depending on what the Healey administration and AG Campbell do here, could we see more communities following Milton's lead when they're not happy with the requirements being imposed on them for one reason or another, and basically saying, no, we're not going to go along with this law?
Well, that's the danger, that this could undermine the whole act, the whole law. if in fact Milton succeeds in blocking it, because a lot of other communities are opposed to this zoning regulation as well. And they could take action if they're emboldened by what happens in Milton. So what happens in Milton is extremely important, and we really don't know yet. I mean, the governor and the attorney general have yet to react to the vote specifically in terms of what they will do, although they did.
Sorry to cut you off. Well, as this plays out, come back. I'd love to have the two of you come back and talk this through, because it's fascinating. And as you just said, Bob, the stakes are pretty high. Bob Seay, Shirley Leung, thank you both.